You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jonathan Meer of Texas A&M University. Jonathan, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
So our topic for today is the minimum wage. Last year, I believe it was last year, or at some point in the past, we had an episode on the Seattle minimum wage study. So you can think of this episode as kind of an update to that one and an expansion of some of the ideas we talked about then. So Jonathan, tell me, how did you get into minimum wage research? What's the sort of backstory there?
So it's actually totally accidental, and this is perhaps a good lesson for any graduate students or researchers who are listening. Most of my research is on the economics of altruism and charitable giving. I also have a bit of a sideline in the economics of education. Some years ago, during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, I had gotten to thinking about how the various mandates in the Affordable Care Act might impact labor markets. This turns out to be actually a fairly mature literature, which I didn't really know at the time, which again is a cautionary tale. But as my then graduate student, Jeremy West, who's now a professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz, he and I were working on it together, and he brings me some results and he says, I've been throwing the minimum wage in as a control variable, and it's always statistically significant and negative. And I'd always thought that, the famous paper by Card and Kruger had shown that maybe it didn't matter as much. And I said, well, I don't actually really know either. And so we went down this rabbit hole with this new line of research that neither of us was particularly experienced in. And as it happened, the first draft of our paper came out right at the moment that the minimum wage made its way back into the national discussion, right around the time that President Obama suggested a $9 an hour federal minimum wage increase. And so I guess the two lessons to take away from this are, one, pay attention to your covariates, because you never know where your actual paper will come from. And two, get a time machine and figure out what the hot topic is going to be 18 months from now and start working on it at this moment. So that's how I sort of stumbled into this minimum wage literature.
Oh, yeah. I have anecdotes about accidentally discovering you've contributed to a literature you didn't intend to. I just ran an experiment that unintentionally has a result that it fits into the wishful thinking literature, but that's a topic for another day. So I don't think I recall, was it Obama's first term when he started discussing a $9 minimum wage? So I don't think I recall a time before this was.
So, I actually have the actual date somewhere. It was at the State of the Union address in 2009, perhaps, or perhaps a little bit. Perhaps no, it was later than that. Excuse me, it was more like 2013. And he suggested $9 an hour, and then the following month, the congressional Democrats proposed $10.10 an hour, and the president endorsed that fairly quickly. And I will give him credit for this, because we should give politicians points for honesty whenever we catch them being honest. He said, 10-10 is easy to remember. There's no scientific basis. I mean, he didn't say there was no scientific basis for it, but he flat out said, 10-10 is an easy thing to remember. And so I guess that's how we do federal labor policy, is with mnemonic devices and things that are easy to remember.
Yeah, so I took my first ever econ course, I believe, in 2008. So I don't think I don't ever remember a time when people weren't talking about the minimum wage, but and also the financial crisis. But I guess I wasn't aware that had I, started a few years sooner, maybe it wouldn't have been. If I went back in time, maybe there was a time when minimum wage was not topical, and so yeah.
Well, the previous federal increase that went up to $7.25 an hour, that took place in large part during the Great Recession and the financial crisis, that was a remarkably uncontroversial increase. I don't have the exact votes in front of me, but it was passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities during the George W. Bush administration. And so the minimum wage is sort of a hot topic of debate, is a relatively recent phenomenon, at least in this part of its life cycle.
Yeah, and so I suppose during the Bush years, people weren't talking about minimum wage, but economists probably were. The same way economists were talking about immigration before Trump, and the Trump campaign made everyone talk about immigration, but so the specific economists who were working on that have found themselves very relevant. Would you say there's been a sort of boom in a change in the amount of research being done on the minimum wage since 2009?
Oh, absolutely. The literature, no literature is ever fully dormant, but it was pretty quiet for a good chunk of the 2000s and the early part of this decade. And now I honestly, I can't keep up with the literature. It moves so quickly. There are so many people working on it in so many facets of it, that it's just a Herculean task to try to stay on top of what's coming out on an almost daily basis.
So what would you say are the sort of general trends in that literature? I mentioned at the start the Seattle minimum wage study, which was, there are many minimum wage studies, but that one was particularly interesting to a lot of people and got a lot of press, rightly so. Could you speak to, well, first those trends, and also just the significance of the Seattle study?
Sure. So let me give you the big picture view first. In the manner in which most minimum wage research was conducted, and much of it is still being conducted, is a very straightforward approach that essentially looks at the effects of these relatively small minimum wage changes that we've had over the last 30 years or so, notwithstanding the large city level minimum wage changes. Most minimum wage changes, even in the states that have increased by a fair amount, they're phased in. So maybe it increases by 50 cents a year for 3 years or something like that. They're relatively small. They bind on a small proportion of the population. This, I think, is one of the things that people are surprised by, that only between 2 and 5% of the population is paid at or below the minimum wage. And that or below part is actually really important, because a lot of the people who are classified as minimum wage workers, in fact, tipped wait staff and bartenders. So their actual take-home pay is significantly above, $7.25 or $9 or often even 12 or 15 an hour. That is what's kind of listed in official statistics when they're asked, what is your hourly pay? And so the vast majority of these papers, what they basically said was, we're going to have annual data or maybe quarterly data on the number of jobs, or possibly the number of employed people, separating out that a job may be filled by a different person. That's something that we'll return to in a little bit. That might be something like, how many restaurant workers are there in this county or in this state this year, versus how many people have a job in this county or in this state this year. And that's a subtle point, but an important one. And we'll come back to it later, I'm sure. And so they would say, essentially, how did this relatively small change in the minimum wage that occurred in state X, but not in state Y, how did it change employment in state X relative to state Y? People who are maybe a little more well-versed in these will recognize this as a difference in differences approach, which is sort of the workhorse model of a lot of policy interventions. And we don't need to get into the technical details of when this might break down, or when it functions well or when it doesn't function well. But the upshot is, it's essentially looking for a change in the number of employed people on a fairly quick basis in response to a relative increase in the minimum wage. So if one place has a minimum wage of $7.75 and another one has a minimum wage of $7.25, you're essentially saying, does a 50-cent increase in the minimum wage impact jobs in the state that increased it relative to the state that didn't increase it? So that sort of sets the groundwork. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can look at why that might be not the best approach. So let me start, before I delve into what the Seattle Minimum Wage Project did, let me talk a little bit about my paper that we kind of previewed earlier. with my former PhD student Jeremy West. So Jeremy and I were concerned that this view of short-term changes was missing part of the picture. There's a lot of reasons to think that the minimum wage will take more time to be reflected in the level of employment. That is the raw number of jobs that are in the economy or the raw number of employed people. And the main reason for this is because firing people is really unpleasant. And it's sort of the last thing that an employer is going to do, because it really does affect the way that, say, a small restaurant operates. You have 4 wait staff. It's kind of a big deal to drop to 3 wait staff. Maybe you try to do something like adjust the number of hours first. Maybe you invest in some capital equipment so that when your dishwasher leaves that role, you don't hire a new dishwasher. You just have more automation. And there's just a number of reasons why the minimum wage might take a longer time to be reflected in the level of. And so that's what we went looking for. We essentially looked at the dynamics of employment, hirings and firings, and job growth. And what we found was that this kind of stereotypical neoclassical approach that we teach to undergrads, that I teach to in my Principles of Microeconomics course, that the minimum wage goes up and you get this instant snap to a new equilibrium. That's kind of a straw man. It's a useful starting point, and it's a useful way to teach these general price theory approaches to undergrads. But we know the world's more sophisticated than that. No matter what people at a cocktail party might say, "Oh, economics is so unrealistic." So yeah, we know that the world's more complicated, and then it may take time for the market to adjust to its new equilibrium with this higher minimum wage. And that's exactly what we found. We found that the job growth slowed, and we replicated this in 3 different government data sets using data from the United States in different contexts and drawn from different sources. And so the other thing that we showed, which is more technical, is that the approaches that were being used in the literature, this difference in differences approach, especially in the more sophisticated versions of it, which were trying to get at some of these dynamics, we showed using made-up data, synthetic data, where we sort of said, let's imagine that this effect is real. Would these models be able to pick out this effect? And the answer was no, they couldn't. And in fact, they were mechanically unable to pick out these effects. If the impact of the minimum wage was sort of slow to hit the number of jobs that in fact hit the job growth rate, these standard difference and differences models were mechanically biased towards finding no effect at all. And we showed that, and then we showed that the real world data kind of followed the pattern that our synthetic data did. Now, that doesn't mean that the world, in fact, operates the way that our synthetic world says it did, but it's pretty hard to tell a story where there's, in fact, no impact of the minimum wage on job growth. There's no impact of the minimum wage on labor markets, but the world just accidentally happens to follow this pattern of results. So let me pause there for a moment, because I know I just said a lot of stuff, and we can regroup and then move on.
Yeah. So, I guess a word to the audience. This is a common sort of technique for testing statistical models. You rather than if you just apply a statistical model to the real world, you know what the results are, but you don't know what the underlying truth in the real world is. So if you can make up a real world where you know what kind of effect, what's generating the statistical pattern that you see, then you can test a statistical method to see if it can pick up on what you put into it, your synthetic data when you created it. So it's a Monte Carlo sort of analysis, and it's very commonly used, and it's used for this specific kind of thing to say, hey, this technique we've been using maybe isn't picking up this particular type of thing. And I guess I also want to you mentioned earlier about the sort of slow change in response to the minimum wage. That is sort of in the Econ 101 theory, because there's the distinction between the short run and the long run. Usual way we distinguish those two in neoclassical econ is, in the short run, the firm's capital stock is fixed, and in the long run, all inputs are variable. And that too would show that, you have a minimum wage, you're going to reduce, how many employees you have more in the long run than the short run. But you were telling a more sort of realistic story about, like, the sort of social pressures on businesses not to fire a quarter of their wait staff, and and the way they sort of gradually transition into a new equilibrium without shaking things up in a way that it's going to upset their employees and disrupt the way they do business.
Let me take that thread and run with it a little bit more. So some of my recent work with Jeff Clemens, who's at UC San Diego, and Lisa Kahn, who's at the University of Rochester, one aspect of it suggests that the effects of the minimum wage on the number of jobs is going to be nonlinear. One of the other assumptions that's baked into these standard models that we're talking about is, a 25-cent minimum wage is going to have this kind of effect, and a 50-cent minimum wage is going to have double the effect of that, and a $1 minimum wage increase is going to double that effect. And that's just baked into the model. And there's some ways around that, but it's actually a pretty strong assumption. And the reason that we might expect the minimum wage to have fairly nonlinear effects has to do, in large part, in my view, with the other margins of adjustment. Jobs are more than just a paycheck and a place to work. There are many, many aspects of a job, as Tyler Cowen and George Mason says. There are a lot of margins always equalize, and there are a lot of margins. So let's think through some of the stuff that makes up a job. Well, there's your wage compensation. That's the easy part. That's the part we see. But there's also non-wage compensation, both formal and informal. So you can think of this as benefits, provision of health insurance, provision of retirement plans, which, we don't often think of things that are provided to low-wage workers in the United States. But after the Affordable Care Act, the provision of health insurance, even for very low-wage workers, became pretty prevalent. But it's still a choice that employers can make. So the hours of work, in most of these statistics, you get counted as having a full-time job, whether or not the employer has cut your hours from, say, 40 to 32. They've cut a shift out of your work. You're still counted as employed, even though your hours fell. And that, of course, is one of the findings of the Seattle Minimum Wage Project. You can imagine that things like schedule flexibility get reduced. So this is particularly common in restaurants where, I'll give you 8 hours a day, but instead of giving you a block of 8 hours, I'll give you, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for lunch, and then, 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. for dinner. And those hours between, I'm not going to pay you because it's too expensive for me to pay you to stand around when there aren't any diners in the restaurant. And then it can get more subtle in things that really aren't going to show up in a government data set. So, for example, I was a bartender in college, and I worked at a hotel restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, the Nassau Inn, and I would get a free meal with each shift, usually from the kitchen. It was good food, and I was a college student, and it was definitely worth something. They didn't have to do that. They could have also charged me for my uniform, for example. If there's an employee parking lot, maybe the employer now charges you for parking instead of giving you free parking. There are many of these margins that just aren't going to show up in these government statistics, but they're a way for employers to claw back some of the on the books wage increase. And that's one of the things that Jeff, Lisa, and I found in the context of health insurance was that employers were making up some of the increased wage costs through this different aspect. And then I think one of the most subtle ways that this can happen is an increase in the expectation of work effort. So, yes, I have to pay you more now, but I expect you to be on time always, and you can't cut out 15 minutes early to go pick up your kid to take them to the doctor. Not because I'm mean, but because I'm now paying you more. And I'm not going to let you trade off schedule flexibility for maybe a slightly lower wage, which again, these compensate, we got to think about compensation and compensation as a holistic thing about your job. And then, I already said maybe the most subtle. Let me give you probably the most subtle one, which is how big of a jerk your boss can be to you. Because if you're sort of getting paid a market wage and there's a lot of other jobs that you could be working and your boss is a huge jerk, you can just leave. But if, let's say it's $15 an hour and there's a huge number of people, there's a line around the corner for people that would take your job in a heartbeat because it's $15 an hour for sweeping floors and you don't have a lot of great options. If you lose this job, it's going to be really hard for you to find another one. Your boss can be a pretty big jerk to you, and not necessarily because they're a terrible person. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they're not going to cut you any slack. Oh, your car broke down, too bad. There's 500 people who would take your job in a heartbeat. Oh, your kid's sick and you got to take him to the doctor. Look, I need the floor swept. We're not letting you out. We're not letting you outstay. And when we think about people's well-being, when we think about the utility that people get, it surprises me that economists are out there saying, well, they're getting paid more, so they must be better off. And there's very little research on this because it's really tough to see this sort of thing. But jobs may be getting worse in ways that are difficult to measure. And some of the gains that are real that people do get from this higher wage may be getting clawed back in these subtle ways that are really difficult to pick out. And to me, the economists who wave their hands at this stuff or completely ignore it, it's a lack of imagination. It's not good economics. It feeds into the stereotype of economists is only concerned about, dollars and cents, and that's the only thing that matters. But what we care about is utility and well-being, and doing so requires being more creative and more thoughtful about what constitutes a job.
Yeah. There's a recent anecdote about that. Amazon boosted the wages of their lowest paid workers, and this isn't a official minimum wage, but you can sort of think of it as the effect of jawboning by politicians. There's sort of an anti-Amazon sort of movement, and Jeff Bezos was like, okay, we're not gonna have low paid workers. We're gonna pay our lowest paid employee $15 an hour, to sort of, it seems that he did it to sort of deflect this criticism, but at the same time, they cut a lot of their benefits. You have more cash now, so buy your own benefits. It was sort of the attitude. So it's not necessarily the case that they increase total compensation. They may have, but it seems more like that $15 an hour number is politically useful to be able to say, hey, we do that. We're leaders on this fight for 15 thing, so we're not the enemy here to try to, because when you're a big company like Amazon, the worst thing that could happen to you is that that you get on the bad side of the government, or of especially a big government like the United States. Yeah, and just another point on that, just to like reinforce how intuitive this is with these. We were talking earlier about how a lot of the early research was looking at 50-cent increases in the minimum wage, but some of the really high ones being proposed now, if you just multiply that increase by the total number of hours being worked by employees at many businesses, that amount is going to be larger for a lot of businesses than their entire profit margin. And so something has to give, and maybe it's employment, but maybe it's something else. But you can't take more than 100% of the profit, and you also can't guarantee that the extra pay to workers is going to be coming out of profit. It might not reduce profits at all.
So let me take that point that you just made, and the usual answer, the sort of knee-jerk answer is, well, they'll just raise prices and people don't mind paying more. And that second part is just really bizarre to me, that we know that demand curves slope down. That is, the more something costs, the less people want to consume of it. So suppose that all of it was passed through to prices. This is not so what would happen? Well, prices go up, people buy less of it, If people buy less of it, then there's less demand for the input to produce that product, which means that there's going to be fewer workers working in those industries. And this is not a new point at all. So the economist H.B. Lees Smith wrote in 1907 that a rise in the price of a commodity will lead to a decrease in the demand for it. This means that a certain amount of the labor and capital hitherto employed in the production of the commodity must seek other occupations. But this is likely to involve both the laborers and the employers in a loss. It is no kindness to workers in a trade to merely turn them out of it. So this is not a new point. This is not a new argument, for sure. I want to make a sort of more philosophical point, because you were talking about Amazon viewing its political prospects as kind of needing to play ball. I think the philosophy underlying the minimum wage is very strange to me, because many of the people who advocate for a higher minimum wage are not people who think that the market should be left to its own devices. And that's kind of a truism, right? That's, you support that kind of intervention in the labor market. You don't want the market to be left to its own devices. And yet there's this underlying unstated premise that employers have a responsibility to their employees beyond paying them a competitive wage for the job that they do. So let's leave aside notions of market power suppressing wages. That is an important point, but it's not the reason for the arguments that many of these people are making. They're essentially saying, you can't live off of $7.25 an hour, which is true. It's extremely difficult to do so. And therefore, employers are responsible for paying people more. And that's weird, because it suggests, for instance, that a restaurant should pay a waiter or a wait person more if they are a single mother of two than if they're the married mother of one and they have a working spouse. But then if their spouse loses their job, the restaurant should give them a raise because they need more money. It's a very strange approach, because we have a tax and transfer system. We have things that are targeted to low-income families, who are not necessarily low-wage workers. And that's a point that I want to come back to in a little bit, who minimum wage workers actually are and whether this is good for redistribution. But even before we talk about that, boggles my mind that people think that firms should be used as a tool for redistribution. Because the minimum wage is a very blunt instrument. It doesn't differentiate between a college student who's earning beer money or a high school student, who's trying to get some money to hang out with their friends on the weekend. And I love the work ethic, but they may be in an upper middle class family, and a single mother who is working hard to get by. The minimum wage says to both of those people, you can have a job, but only if it pays at or above this level. And it says to the employer, don't let us catch you hiring this person for less than this amount. And so from a philosophical perspective, it's very strange to me, because I would think that if we want to redistribute money from high-income people to low-income people, or high-resource people to low-resource people, we have a system to do that, the tax and transfer system. And the minimum wage is not that, because half of minimum wage workers are under the age of 25. Half of those are high school or college students. And in fact, 10% of households with minimum wage workers in them in the United States earn over $115,000. These are the teenage children of upper middle class families. They're not the proper targets of redistributive anti-poverty policy.
Yeah, it seems like, there's a result from behavioral economics that says that people engage in narrow bracketing, meaning they look at each problem or question separately and not with respect, not in the context of all the other things that they might be thinking about. So, you sort of focus in on one thing. And so, when we're talking about minimum wages and when people are debating them out in the public sphere, usually they're not thinking about like, okay, is this better or worse than some other anti-poverty measure or means of reducing inequality, given if assuming if it is worse, should we do that other thing instead or in addition to? But I think people tend to, when they're thinking about the minimum wage, they're thinking about it as if it was the only anti-poverty measure and the only means of reducing inequality. And then they, when they're thinking about welfare, they think about that as if it were the only means of transferring. But really, you should think about those two things together and whether they're complements or substitutes. And I think the argument you're making there is that they are substitutes.
Indeed, and I've arrived at the point where I'd like to get back to that question. Different people in the same job, which is again something that I've worked on with Jeff Clemens and Lisa Kahn. So as I've alluded, the distribution of people who are employed in minimum wage jobs doesn't actually look like a low income distribution. I recently plotted the percent of minimum wage workers in households by income level in 5% bins. So slice up the income distribution into 20 slices and look to see what percent of those households have minimum wage workers in it. And it's essentially flat across the board. There's not really a difference in the percent of households that have a minimum wage worker in them that earn more than $150,000 and that earn, between $35,000 and $45,000. Now, those are different types of people, to be sure. But again, that, if we were to distribute money to minimum wage workers, even with no loss of employment, it would actually likely be a regressive redistribution because a lot of the money would be going to high income families. And if we supposed that there was pass through to prices, that prices were higher, well, a large number of minimum wage workers are employed in food service, which means that the price of food would go up, and low-income households spend a higher proportion of their income on food. So Tom McCurdy has a paper from a few years ago that actually shows that a minimum wage increase, even with no impact on employment, is kind of equivalent to a regressive tax on food. But there's a more important point here. Well, I guess that's a pretty important point, but there's a point that I really want to make, which is about labor substitution. Which is a perhaps confusing way of saying, are you as an employer going to substitute one type of worker for a different type of work? And there's pretty strong evidence that suggests that's the case. And that's, again, notice that what that's going to show us is if we're trying to count up the number of jobs may not change, but the type of person who's employed in them will change. So we do have evidence that suggests that employers tend to shift towards workers who are older and more credentialed. Jeff, Lisa, and our recent paper shows that actually job ads for low-wage work are more likely to ask for a high school diploma after the minimum wage goes up. There's other evidence that they look for more experienced workers, more skilled workers who are more productive. John Horton at NYU has this fantastic field experiment with a online job posting platform where he was able to impose minimum wages on some employers but not others. And what he found was that employers didn't necessarily cut back the number of projects that they were doing, but they paid out for fewer hours. And then in large part, this was happening because employers were screening for more experienced and productive employers in this very cool context where that's kind of very observable in ways that may not be as observable in the in the real labor market. And another really interesting result on Arcidiacono and Wessels shows that even when employers continue to hire teenagers, they seem to be hiring teenagers who come from more affluent families. Which you may even, they don't make this point, but my mind always jumps to this may be related to race, just because there's a strong correlation between family income and race. You can also think, and this point goes back half a century to Milton Friedman, that and Gary Becker, that the minimum wage allows employers to indulge in discrimination, because if there's a huge excess supply of workers who would like to have your $15 an hour job sweeping floors, it's very difficult to see whether or not there's discrimination taking place. But employers are more able to say, well, I've got 500 applicants for this job. I'm going to pick the one who, I like the way they look. Or I'm going to pick the one who's not going to be a pain in my rear because they've got a sick kid and they need to leave work earlier. And so even if the number of jobs doesn't change, the least experienced, most marginalized populations are likely to be the ones that suffer. There's no reason to take a chance on someone with a felony conviction on their record if you've got, I'm going to take a cheap shot here, someone with a BA in English who is willing to do this job for $15 an hour. Hire the neatly dressed English major over the guy who's had, kind of a rough life. And what we know is that labor market experience is incredibly important for moving up that job ladder. If you never get that entry level job or that re-entry level job in the case of someone who's, maybe had some labor market interruption, then it's very, very hard to ever move out of it. And now I promised you I was going to come back full circle to the Seattle Minimum Wage Project. Their most recent paper, which was actually able to follow workers longitudinally, which they hadn't been able to do in their first paper. What I mean by that is they were able to follow some of the same workers over time, which is obviously a really powerful thing to be able to do. They found that I think the two most important takeaways from my perspective were that there was an increase in income for many workers. At least a quarter of it seemed to be coming from people picking up jobs outside of the city of Seattle. That is to say, commuting outside of Seattle in order to get a job somewhere else in a locality that had a lower minimum wage, which is, that doesn't sound super pleasant to have to commute longer for that different job, in large part because their hours were being cut at their existing Seattle job. But all of the gains were concentrated among more experienced workers. Among less experienced workers, there was no gain and often even losses. And I don't want to do a disservice to their paper by being too specific because I don't have a complete grasp on the exact numbers of this. But there definitely was a heavy concentration among the most experienced people, which again is one of these subtle margins that you might adjust on. Whereas, you used to hire fresh teenagers or people with some labor market interruptions for your cashier jobs. Well, now, if you've got to pay them that much, you only want people with experience because you don't have time for them to screw up for a month or two as they figure it out. Your margins are too narrow. Profit margins are razor thin for restaurants. You really can't afford to train somebody. And so getting back to the question of redistribution, the minimum wage is that blunt instrument, and the people that it's likely to exclude from the labor force are the ones that really need the most help, in my view. And so I view it as a very bad anti-poverty policy in that context.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many great points here. So a really interesting part of this is that you can have disemployment effects among some workers without having general disemployment effects if some people are drawn into the labor market or into working more by the higher wage. So like the example of the college student who maybe doesn't have to work. They could be doing something else. They could be studying harder to try to graduate sooner or something. But they at $10 an hour, they would have done something else, and at 15 they enter the labor force. And maybe someone who is less experienced or has a felony conviction or something gets edged out of the labor force then without a net loss of jobs. It's you still have one person is still working. It's just a different person, and that's such a great point.
And I do want to make sure that we don't fall into the lump of labor fallacy, that there's a fixed number of jobs, and if someone takes this job, then there's a mechanical -1 job in for somebody else. I would say that we have to be, to take your point, that we have to be very thoughtful about these offsetting effects, and in particular, that just counting the number of jobs isn't super interesting. And when if we're thinking about the minimum wage in the context of anti-poverty policy, then we are really worried about who is more likely to benefit. And if there are people entering the labor force, and I like your description of the college student, when the minimum wage goes from, say, 10 to 15, that's over their reservation wage. And now, they pick up a couple of shifts here and there, and they're clean cut and nice, and the employer likes them, and maybe customers like them. And so they're more likely to have that job than maybe someone who doesn't look as the way that the employer might want them to look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wasn't meaning to get into the lump of labor fallacy, but assuming that a lot of the literature that, as you earlier pointed out, might be using misspecified models. A lot of the literature seems to show no net effect on employment. So you can condition on that, and then show a change in who is working, even if that's true, which of course which you dispute, and I don't generally believe either. So let's talk about the sort of minimum wage policy moving forward. Seattle, I mean, the reason the Seattle minimum wage study is so significant, two reasons. One is that Seattle is cranking up its minimum wage very high, very fast. Well, not very fast, but at least very high. I think it's currently 13. It's going to go up to 15.
It's already 15, and it's now benchmarked to inflation, and so it will continue to go up. And that's a policy that has been picked up by a lot of other municipalities and even some states. So California is at $10.50 currently, and they're scaling up to $15 an hour by 2022. San Francisco has hit 15 an hour. Los Angeles is scaling up to 15 an hour. New York State, and this, I think, the ones in California and New York State are, to me, the most interesting, because both of them will be 15 an hour in the next few years. Both of those states, the stereotype is, big city, big rich city, San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles. But both of those states have very rural areas, some of which are, economically depressed even now, and where the prevailing wage is going to bind on a very, very large proportion of the population. One margin that we haven't discussed, which has not really been important in the United States in recent years because the minimum wage hasn't been high enough for this to really be a useful thing to do, but shifting to, kind of gray market work of going off the books. Because if you run a tavern in, rural upstate New York, and all of a sudden you're being told that you need to pay $15 an hour, and incidentally, many of these states have moved away from the tip credit, which is that if you're a tipped employee, there's a sub-minimum wage. That the federal sub-minimum wage is $2.13 an hour, but the assumption is that customers are directly paying the labor costs. California no longer has a tip credit, which is to say that the minimum wage for tipped workers is the same as for untipped workers. That's also true, I believe, in Washington State, or at least in the city of Seattle. And in, I think, in New York State as well, though I may be wrong on that last one. So now all of a sudden you're being told, you have to pay $15 an hour in a place where the median wage may have been $12 an hour up until that point. And you either close your tavern or you find something else, and that something else may very well be, hey, we got to pay you cash. I'll pay you $8 an hour, but it's going to be under the table. And I think, and I'm hypothesizing here, but that's going to become more and more common, especially in these places that are being dragged along on these big city adventures when they in fact are in areas with much, much lower prevailing wages.
Yeah, it reminds me of there was a minimum wage increase quite a while ago. I believe before I was born, but it was a national minimum wage increase in the United States, and it applied to Puerto Rico because it's a U.S. territory, and I believe it was a fairly low minimum wage for the United States in general, but it was an incredibly high one for Puerto Rico and had just a massive effect. So we're seeing the same thing now with San Francisco versus rural California, where there's so many more voters in San Francisco and LA than in the rest of California, so they can pass the policies that they want and maybe make sense in their specific context of being a very high wage economy already. But then they, with somewhat unthinkingly, impose it on areas that are absolutely not high wage economies and are going to have serious problems with this. And the indexing to inflation is interesting because in the past, legislatures would either raise the minimum wage or let it quietly get inflated away. And so there was upward and downward movement in the minimum wage in real terms. I can't see there ever being downward movement in the minimum wage once it's indexed to inflation, just the way politics works. Like quietly not increasing minimum wage is politically feasible, but actively cutting it seems like something that no politician would be willing to do.
I think you're right on that, and I think that is a particularly concerning issue for all of the reasons that economists worry about wage stickiness, which is to say, when there's a recession and productivity is down because productivity is sort of down across the economy, if there's no ability to adjust wages, then you just have to fire people. And I could see this really exacerbating the impact of recessions on low-wage workers, when wages can't be inflated away if we're trying to, spark an economic recovery in a manner that goes hand in hand with some inflation. That wage rigidity is, a well-known problem, mostly studied by macroeconomists for economic recoveries. So I should say I'm by no means an expert on anything having to do with macro, but we do have some recent research recently published by Michael Strain and his co-author that looks at the difference between nominal wage increases and wage increases that are also indexed to inflation. And this, I think, is a point that is a finding that's very consonant with my work with Jeremy, which is that Strain finds that real minimum wage increases, or rather minimum wage increases that employers know will continue to go up, seem to have much larger impacts on employment outcomes than nominal ones that employers kind of know maybe will get dissipated over time. And so, if you know that the minimum wage is going up to say $9 an hour, but it's going to stay there for the next 5 or 6 years, it'll get eroded. Okay, maybe you grit your teeth, you can get through it. You find some other margin to adjust, or maybe you hire some more productive worker. If you know that it's kind of $9 an hour permanently, and that's going to mean, it's going to be $10 3 years from now and $11, a couple of years after that, or whatever, then you have to think carefully about your entire production function, about the way that you produce whatever your output is. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we're seeing capital labor substitution. It's certainly not the only reason. Capital is getting cheaper, by which I mean things like ordering kiosks and apps and things like that. I think anyone who's been in an airport recently has seen that, there's iPads everywhere. You can order your food from them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, 15 years ago, that technology just didn't exist, and now it's pretty cheap. But certainly increases in the cost of labor mean that we're going to substitute towards other ways of producing those things. The other one of the other margins that the production function can be adjusted on is customer labor substitution. So there's a paper by a couple of a Bureau of Census economists that showed that the adoption of self-service gas stations in the United States seems to have been pushed along quite a bit by higher minimum wages. There was also a recent New York Times article saying that restaurants in San Francisco can't find wait staff, and so they're putting customers to work, and that there's kind of a new segment of dining which they're calling fast fine. So these are $30 entrees and good food, but you order at the counter and you bust your own tray, and you if you want something else, if you want to refill on your glass of $15 glass of wine, you got to go up to the counter to get it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe people are fine with that. But the reason for it is because these restaurants just can't afford to hire wait staff to give that fine dining experience at a price point that I think most people would say, that's a pretty high price point. And I'm not, these changes, some of these changes would have probably happened anyway for a number of reasons, but they're certainly being exacerbated. And all of them mean that there are fewer relatively low skill, relatively low wage, what we might think of as entry level jobs that, again, make it that much more difficult for young people, for people who have been out of the labor force for a while, to even get started. And that's the part that I find so concerning when we look at the problems of labor force participation in, I think, all developed countries, but particularly in the United States. Those are going to be problems that reverberate through society for decades. And I'm not saying that they're caused by the minimum wage, but the harder you make it for people to find a job, the fewer people are going to be in those jobs, and the more of them are going to feel disaffected, disconnected, unable to get ahead. And I think that that's really going to cause a lot of societal problems for the future.
Yeah, that's kind of a dark note to end on, but
yeah, sorry about that. I guess I'm just a dark and cynical person.
But it's important to be concerned about these things. So my guest today has been Jonathan Meer. Jonathan, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.